So this is 1 Timothy chapter 1, the scripture for Thursday the 24th of September. 1 Timothy is the first of Paul's pastoral epistles. The pastoral epistles are 1st and 2nd Timothy along with Titus, so called because in these epistles, Paul does more than just theorize about theology. Paul talks about how to lead and how to govern a church and a community, how to care for it. Their focus is on church leadership, and they offer best practices for congregations. Because of their different focus, and also because of their different vocabulary to Paul's authentic letters, definitely authentic letters, particularly if you look at the Greek, they use different words and different phrases entirely. And because of this, some scholars have cast doubt on Paul's authorship of these pastoral epistles. Regardless, though, as to whether Paul himself wrote all of these epistles or maybe whether he wrote the kernel of them, had his scribe fill them in, we don't know how much of a sort of system Paul had. We do know he had scribes, and some of the theology seems to fit with some of what Paul says. But regardless, his relationship with his protégés, Timothy and Titus, do stand at the forefront of these letters. And as you may remember, Timothy began traveling with Paul in Acts 16, and Timothy is constantly mentioned throughout Paul's letters. So for the purposes of these videos, we're just going to use the name Paul to refer to the author of these letters, and we're not going to really get into any more the question of authorship. Now, in many of Paul's letters, after the opening where Paul names himself, Paul says, grace and peace, Paul names who he's writing to, there's often, a lengthy 5 to 10 verse benediction or sort of encouragement at the beginning. That flies out the window in 1 Timothy. It shows Paul's urgency to get to the point of the letter that Paul doesn't even spend time blessing Timothy. It's sort of like, it's understood. I love you. Let's get down to brass tacks. The problem leading to this writing is apparently that there are some people in Ephesus who are modeling unhelpful practices to the Christians there. They are, as we talked about back in Romans 14 at the beginning of this week, majoring in minor things. I've linked the video to Romans 14 in case you missed it. Teachers more fascinated by speculation than by God's actual work in the lives of actual people, they're not helpful in the Christian church. Speculation can be neat, but when it takes the place of real ministry, we've lost the thread of the gospel. Paul's not rejecting the law that the false teachers base their teaching on, and this is important. Paul always, over and over again, claims the goodness of the law, and that it's bad when it's misused, or it's bad when it leaves some room for sin to creep in. As in elsewhere in Paul's writings, the law is good, and we've covered Paul's lists of disobedient behaviors before, similar to the one he gives here in 1 Timothy 1. You can find them in 1 Corinthians 6, which I've linked below, along with Romans 1, which I've linked below as well. There are other vice lists that Paul has, but those are the two I think I go into in most detail in these videos. So instead of focusing on that, we're going to move on to the section where Paul names his own lawlessness and his own rebellion. And it's always interesting to hear Paul talk about his life before he met Christ, and here is no different. He's very not depressed about his life, but he sees it pretty clearly that he was operating for the forces of evil. Now, throughout the pastorals, you're going to see this phrase appear a number of times. It goes something like, "This saying is sure and worthy of full acceptance." This is Paul's version of Jesus' "truly, truly, I say unto you." It means sit up, take notice of what Paul's about to say. And Paul's self-identification here as the chief of sinners is something we can all confess, that we are deeply sinful and Jesus Christ came to save sinners. At the end of this chapter, Paul mentions turning two individuals over to Satan. That's a little bit confusing. It's something that seems like it might need a little bit more unpacking. But I think while there's speculation about this, it's always made sense to me that Satan, which is the Hebrew word for the accuser, the one who prosecutes against us with God, Satan's going to hold in front of you each and every time you've fallen short. And so to turn these two over to Satan is sort of like Paul saying, they need to sit with their sin for a little bit. it. They need to understand what they've done. And we too need to know the depth of our sin in order to treasure the depths of God's grace. I wonder, when have you focused on things that didn't matter? That's all for 1 Timothy 1. Tomorrow, the 25th of September, we'll look at 1 Timothy chapter 2. May God bless you in your reading of Scripture.